Hi, everybody. The purpose of this lecture is to give you a very kind of brief introduction to the Cold War and kind of Cold War theory here. What happened is this, is normally if we'd been in school and stuff, we would have finished World War II a while back. We would have done kind of two units on the Cold War, the early Cold War and then kind of the late Cold War, really focusing on Europe and Latin America, and actually probably about 60% Latin America, 40% Europe or so. It's one of the two times that Latin America, like these two units, are the times that like Latin America probably has a bigger focus than Europe and or so. Because of essential new learning and cutting down and stuff like that, what we've decided to do is focus the Cold War, but really focus on it from a Latin American perspective for the most part. A lot of the European stuff you'll get in U.S. history because the Cold War is U.S. versus the USSR. And a lot of the Latin American stuff will like help you understand U.S. history more, so you'll get it back around. I'll throw in a few things from Europe that I really want to do from time to time, but this is kind of where we are, unfortunately, with essential new learning. So instead of focusing on the European side of it, we'll be looking at the Cuban Revolution, we'll be looking at the Argentine Dirty Wars, we'll be looking at like Che in Guatemala, various other things that occurred, et cetera, down there, Operation Condor, blah, blah, blah. However, before we can do that, we need to do a introduction to the Cold War, how we got there, and talk a little bit about Cold War theory, and this is precisely what that is going to do. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a sign that says you are entering the American sector. Remember, Berlin has been divided into four sectors. Nazi Germany is in rubble. The Allies are victorious, and things are going to go south really, really fast. You are entering the American sector, carrying weapons off duty, forbidden, obey traffic rules. This is known as Checkpoint Charlie. And essentially what I'm going to be arguing to you in this is that two fears really led to the Cold War. One was the West's massive fear of communism. That was a big deal. They were not ready for this. There had been a Red Scare in the 20s. Communism seemed opposed to democracy, even though one's an economic system and the other is a political system. But hey, and Stalin's massive paranoia. We talked about Stalin's paranoia from the beginning, and it's really going to play into things here. Joseph Stalin is absolutely convinced that World War III is coming, and it's coming between the Western Allies and him, and he needs to be prepared for it. So essentially what this lecture is going to be arguing is the West's fear of communism and perception of the USSR, and perception that the USSR reneged on a series of deals made at various conferences at the end of World War II, coupled with Joseph Stalin's paranoia about a third World War, led to an increasing divide between the Allies at the end of World War II. This caused tacit escalation on both sides, resulting in the perception that two ideologies were opposite and incompatible. The result was a series of moves, isolation, and dividing Europe between East and West, resulting in the Cold War. Now, what is the Cold War, you might ask? Well, let's define this here, because some of this is going to be history, but some of this is also going to be terms and theory here, which is why I needed to do kind of an introductory lecture like this before we went into other things. And we will be doing more kind of discussion and individual exploration in this unit now that we're done with the paper, or almost done with the paper. But I like to give you like some direct instruction at the beginning, because one thing students always tell me is, Doran, it makes sense, especially when you sit down and explain it to me to start with. So here we go. What is the Cold War? Okay, a Cold War is a series, or the Cold War is a series of escalated diplomatic and economic conflicts centering around a feud between the USA and the USSR. Okay, it is called a Cold War because there was never a direct conflict between the two countries. At no time did the United States declare war directly on the USSR or vice versa. Okay, having said that, the Cold War contained a series of proxy wars, like Korea, like Vietnam, like Afghanistan. And by that I'm talking about Afghanistan in the 1980s with the Soviet Union, stuff like that. The Cold War contained a series of economic and diplomatic discords. It was a conflict of both hard, that's economic, and also the proxy wars, as well as soft power. The Cold War also turned into a pissing contest sometimes. I mean, come on, it was in 1980 that we boycotted the Moscow Olympics, and they turned around and boycotted the Olympics of all things, in 1984 on both sides. So, like, that's what we mean by Cold War. The big difference, though, is, as I said, a war of basically everything except for direct, hot, quote-unquote, war confrontation. So how do we get here? Well, at the end, remember, it says, like, what's going on in Europe in World War II? Well, at first, there's signs of cooperation, and things are going pretty darn well. You've seen this picture before down here. The other one, which comes from the end of VJ Day, the like famous kiss. You see the Americans on top of one of the Reich buildings up there. I mean, there are massive signs of cooperation, and it's not just in pictures. We have it like very tangibly in a couple events. The first really important cooperation piece that we need to talk about, and it might be the most important because you can say what you want about its inefficiency, what it can do, what it can't do, but if the overarching goal of the United Nations is to prevent World War III, then I think we can say it's been a success. Okay, and this is the United Nations. Okay, this was created on April 1st, 1945, when the UN Charter was approved in San Francisco. Okay, and it's headquartered in New York City. I know you guys did some with it in ninth grade. We're not going to go into it a ton or anything like that. Just know that it was built off Wilson's League of Nations, which had failed miserably because it had been able to prevent World War II, and it had never been and the U.S. had never joined. So it was built off this, and it was built significantly stronger. Okay, the conquering powers from World War II on both sides. Okay, so when I say that, I include the Pacific War. Okay, the United States, China, the USSR, Britain, and France are the five permanent members of the Security Council, and they can veto anything. And they basically are kind of like, while everybody gets a say in this, you have a like Security Council that has the real kind of power, and those five kind of have set up this system where they're kind of safeguarding or see themselves as safeguarding the world under the UN. Is it the most efficient thing in the world? No. Does it absolutely work in adjudicating conflicts? No. Have there still been a number of small conflicts or even major conflicts or genocides that have occurred flat out as a result of this that the UN has been powerless to stop? Yes. Has it has it led to World War III? No, which was really the overarching point to begin with. So you can decide whether you think it's worthwhile or not. But that is one of two things worth talking about when we talk about cooperation here. Okay, the second bit of cooperation that I want to talk about in the early like parts of cooperation here is something called the Nuremberg Trials, and this is an Allied military tribunal to try the surviving high-ranking Nazis at the end of the war. Now that sounds kind of weird to history prior to this because generally you just did whatever you wanted to, like executed, sold into slavery, crap like that. Not necessarily in the 20th century, but prior to the 20th century, when you won the war. And basically Churchill had apparently said to Roosevelt at some point, like, "Man, I can't wait till we get to like line up all these Nazis and shoot them. That'll be a blast." And Roosevelt said something along the lines of, "Okay, appreciated, but like, isn't that exactly what we would or they would do if they won? And aren't we better than that?" And so he talked him into creating a military tribunal. And they chose Nuremberg because it was the location of the famous Nazi Party rallies as well as the Nuremberg laws and stuff like that. And make no mistake about this, this is part real court. Okay, some people are actually acquitted in this thing, but it is also part kangaroo court, which means kind of fake court, predetermined conclusion. For example, there is no way that Hermann Goering, Hitler's number two, head of the Luftwaffe and like head of the Reichstag, is going to walk out of here alive, right? Um, so they finally agree on a system to this. The USSR really doesn't want to do this. They really just want to shoot him as well as Churchill had. But to be honest, when the race to Berlin had occurred, the USSR, the Nazis knew they'd really screwed over the USSR. They'd killed 22.5 million of their citizens, plus the army, plus the Eastern Holocaust, and uncountable things that the Einsatzgruppen did that we can't even figure out at this point, right? And so they knew the retribution from the Soviets was going to be brutal. And as a result, like they had basically run west to surrender to the U.S. and to the U.K. and places like that. And so since the U.S. and U.K. wanted to do this this way, the USSR kind of had to agree. And they tried the Nazis for four crimes: conspiracy to wage war, waging aggressive war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So conspiracy to wage war is people who plan the war. Waging aggressive war is people who actually fought it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the generals and the other people that did this. War crimes would be things that were carried out that like were generally considered to be against what's acceptable in war, like shooting prisoners after they'd surrendered, things like the Malmedy Massacre, etc. And crimes against humanity basically was the Holocaust. 11 Nazis are sentenced to death. Hermann Goering, like most high-ranking Nazis, had a tooth removed in the back where he had a cyanide capsule. So he actually, about 15 to 20 minutes before he's supposed to be hanged, pops a cyanide capsule and commits suicide. And the other 10 Nazis, high-ranking Nazis, are hanged at that point. Most of the really, really, really important ones like Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, Heydrich, et cetera, were dead at this point. But the Nuremberg trials, aside from representing cooperation, are really important because they are the precedent for future war crimes trials in the International Criminal Court today. And so they really serve as kind of an example of like what could happen in an ideal world before things started to go downhill fast. And by the time we hit Potsdam, okay, which is July of 45, things are going downhill very, very fast because the Allies have very, very, very different ideas of what they want to do. Okay, the U.S. and Britain are really trying very hard to avoid the same mistakes as Versailles and the other treaties that crippled Germany after that. The USSR is out for revenge, as I talked about on the previous slide. France is really kind of just chilling, happy to get a voice at the table. They generally tend to side the U.S. and Britain, but on the other hand, they are a little bit wanting to like get retribution on the Nazis for some of the things they did and the fact they occupied Paris and stuff like that. So they're kind of in between, but generally on the side of the Allies. And two very distinct parties form eventually. With the U.S. Britain, this is like the height of their like special relationship and being best friends, as we still are today, on one side, and the USSR on the other side, and then France will kind of quietly go over to the U.S. and Britain side as things go along. Now, explain part of the problems here. To explain part of the problems here, and to explain like exactly why there was kind of this divide here, it really goes back to like the aftermath of the war. Because if you think about it, this war ends in May of '45, and large segments of major cities are absolutely crushed. I'll show you pictures in a second. London is in ruins, blah, 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 blah. Everywhere else, as you'll see in a second, is there, which means millions of people are displaced, families are lost, etc., etc. I'm going to keep talking about this as I kind of go through the pictures. You can take a look on this one right here of what London looked like in '45. You can see the vast majority of it leveled, with the exception of St. Paul's right there. So, and the end result is that like agriculture is massively disrupted, and like it's really kind of a free for all, to be honest, in Europe at this point. I remember listening to a lecture from a Holocaust survivor one time who said that he needed to get from he had finished. The war, he'd been on one of those like kind of death marches at the end, like Elie Wiesel night, and he'd finished the war actually in the kind of northeastern part of Germany, and he needed to get back to Vilnius, so he just grabbed a bike that some Dutch cop had there, and he just rode it back to Vilnius, so I'm kind of stopping on the side of the road and stuff like that, and that's really gives you an idea. I mean, this is before the EU when there were open borders and stuff like that of the complete chaos that things were in. Um, and flip over to the next one, and you can see a picture of Warsaw in 1945 here, just completely leveled after the Nazis had not only taken out like the ghetto during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but if you finish watching The Pianist, you also saw the Warsaw General Uprising at the end, and they completely leveled the city. I think about 95% of the city is destroyed. And so, with this being in the war ends in May of '45. We've got tons of people all over the place. All sorts of people displaced. Aside from people that were in camps, but also like people who fought, and then civilians and stuff like that. And by the time you get that sorted out and settled and stuff like that, you're looking at August or September. And by the time you hit October and November, like the winter is starting to set in, right? And so the overarching problem, and we'll flip over to Berlin so you can see here, is that like people are hungry. Governments are not necessarily in place. People are hungry, and nobody's really kind of able to take control of this, right? And in Eastern Europe, you have the Red Army, which has been left in kind of the vast majority of Eastern Europe. I think everything that they conquered over, they just left kind of remnants there. Almost like a trail of like I don't know anything like Hansel and Gretel like leaving a trail in the woods. They just left people there, right? Like blah blah blah. And so like they are issuing a command economy where they're saying you do this, you do this, you do this, and while things are not good, people are at least eating. Meanwhile, over in the West, right? And if we flip over here, if we flip over this, you can see the Dutch city of Rotterdam, which is beyond level here, right? Meanwhile, over in the West is going with this kind of capitalist thing that it's gone with in the past. And things are not working well because they're saying, okay, start like, a business, blah, 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 but there's no money to start it. There's no way to do that. And so winter sets in and people are actually starting to get hungry. Like agriculture is disrupted, there are shortages, etc., etc. And they look to Eastern Europe at that point, and the end result is that communism becomes very, very attractive. And as you can see, when I showed you all these pictures of the various cities and stuff like that, when you have completely leveled something like that, like you actually need kind of almost at the beginning command people to tell you what to do. And so as a result, it's very, very, very possible that like large swaths of Europe convert to communism at this point. Okay, with all that in mind, like what's to be done? Well, to be honest, it requires leadership on the part of the United States because the United States has been the world's largest economy for over 60 years at this point, and they are the only major economy not completely in shambles, right? And so the U.S. realizes that it's in its best interest to have a strong Europe, right? That is going to do one thing. They want to have a strong, economically viable Europe because they can make all sorts of crap as much as they want, but who are they going to sell it to if they can't sell it to like Western Europe, right? Two, they want to avoid a second Versailles, right? And massive like inflation and problems in Germany where you had to take a like wheelbarrow of cabbage to like the market. And three, they want to help contain communism. So they come up with this thing called the Marshall Plan, and it's created by Secretary of State George Marshall, which is how it gets its name. And what they're going to do is they're going to give roughly $13 billion. Okay, and so that's about 1/20th of the United States GDP. That's absolutely massive at this point if you consider we've got a multi-trillion-dollar GDP, right? Um, and they're going to just give it away to Western Europe. They actually are offer it to all sorts of places. They offer it to anybody in Europe. No string is attached. The USSR, which has its troops in Eastern Europe at that point, will not let the communist bloc or what will become the communist bloc take it. So the vast majority of stuff goes to Britain, France, the future West Germany, the Netherlands, etc., etc. But between 1947 and 1951, the United States just gives Europe money in order to like do this, and it does a number of things, as I said before. Helps kind of spark like a post-war revival in multiple places, helps avoid a second Versailles inflation, and really, really, really the big point is to help contain communism here. And I wanted you just to take a second with this individual right here. This is the person who has become president of the United States at this point, the 33rd president, maybe my personal favorite president of all time, Harry S. Truman. He succeeded FDR when FDR died in 45. And it's going to be him who is responsible for ending the war, him who's responsible for bringing this up, for the UN, for all those things, etc., etc. Churchill, who's always given to hyperbole, and I don't believe this to be true at all, one time said that Truman, was most responsible for saving Western civilization more than anybody ever. And again, as I said, I think that's a bit of hyperbole, but it gives you an idea of the individual here. I'll, before I go on, leave you with my favorite Truman story here. Truman, who was very famous for having a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." Um, he one time was in the White House and somebody jumped the fence and they tried to assassinate him and they shot at him. And he first of all looked out the window and was like, "Oh, what's going on?" Which is actually funny because if the assassin had looked up, they could have shot the president in a second. Not that that's funny, but you know what I mean. It's ironic. Anyway, but once he got done and once they got the assassin tackled, etc., etc., he looked at the Secret Service and said, "Okay, I'm going for a walk." And they said, "No, you're not going to do that right now." And he said, "No, no, no. You just have to expect these things when you're president. I'm going for a walk." And he walked out the door and they had to follow him. So that kind of gives you an idea of the man we're dealing with here and like who is going to become the leader of the United States from the time of Roosevelt's death all the way to the election of Eisenhower in 52. Yeah, so Truman and the Marshall Plan don't do a lot to really kind of help what is the slowly smoldering fire of what's about to become the Cold War. Now, just to add further fuel to it, if you remember at Yalta, the Allies had agreed that they were going to conquer Germany, agree to unconditional surrender, and then divide it up into four zones. Okay, now they hadn't really decided who was going to get what zone, etc., etc. And when the USSR wins the race, um, they forever change the course of history because they get there and they decide which part of Germany they're going to take themselves. Now, I'm going to flip over and I'll keep talking, but I want to show this to you on a map because it'll make a lot more sense when you can actually see it. You can see right there that the USSR comes over and it takes the eastern part of Germany there. Now, let's note that this is what has historically been the most important culturally, socioeconomically, as far as the landed gentry goes, that kind of part of Prussia, etc., etc. Okay, so they take that. The United States gets the southeastern part of Germany right there where Munich is, Britain in the north, and then France gets that little sliver right there so that they can say they got something. Um, Now, they also, and this is really, really confusing, but it's important to understand, they also decide to divide up Berlin. Okay? And when they divide up Berlin, the Soviet Union also takes the most fashionable and eastern part right there. Now, what you have in this situation, though, and this is tough, though, is that you've got a divided city within East Germany, if that makes sense, or what's about to become East Germany, because very, very soon the Western Allies are going to unite their like major parts right here, the French, the British, and the American zone, as you can see on the right, to become something that's going to be called West Germany, because this is basically Germany's punishment for this war, is they don't get to be a full country again until 1990. And then the Soviet Union is going to leave this part right here as East Germany, right? And it wasn't necessarily meant to be that way, but as the conquering allies continue to have differences, they can't resolve anything, and so this is where they land. But Britain, France, and the United States, as you can see in the middle, also, that's a map of Berlin, and they have this part of Berlin called West Berlin, right? And then the Soviet Union has this part of Berlin called East Berlin. Now, they also took the most fashionable part and stuff like that as well. And so, what Berlin exists as a city within a occupied country. So, like for example, if you live in this part of Berlin where the Allies are, you are a West German and West Berliner, and you are free, etc., etc. And if you live in the part where the East Berlin, where the Soviet Union is, you are not. And the Berlin Wall, as we'll get to later, actually runs around that area to keep people from going in and out of what is West Berlin, right? Um, but this gives you an idea of kind of the animosity that's going to come up here, because like what was like a like supposed to be like temporary divided thing is going to lead to a permanent thing. The Soviet Union is going to hold puppet elections, in which admitted by the name of Walter Ulbricht is going to become basically a Stalin puppet here, and then he'll be followed by Erich Honecker later on. And then the United States, Britain, and France are going to also hold eventually by 54 elections in East Germany, in which a dude by the name of Konrad Adenauer is going to be come in, and you're going to have two very, very, very distinct different states. And this, by the way, Berlin with its like east, right, and west, right there divided, is going to become ground zero for the Cold War. Like, if war is going to start, it is going to begin in Berlin. Okay, the first example of what could actually become ground zero here is something called the Berlin Airlift. Now, to make a really, really, really long story short, because I know this is probably going to be like a 30, 32-minute lecture, and I don't want to take too much of your time up today. Um, the allies, the Western allies, okay, so when I say the Western allies, that means Britain, France, and the United States, okay, they had decided that they wanted to get rid of the Reichsmark and introduce a new currency called the Deutschmark, right, which is what was the current currency of Germany until the euro started, right? And Stalin, or the Soviet Union, um, really didn't want to do this, okay? Stalin thought that this would lead to a stronger Germany, which is exactly what the Allies wanted. He was trying to cripple Germany, etc., etc. Okay, and when they say they want to do this, Stalin's response to this is to blockade East Berlin. Now, this is important because I said you've got a city within East Germany that has a small part of it, or not actually a small part of it, probably about two-thirds of it, occupied by the Western Allies and part of West Germany and West Berlin, right? And Stalin is going to blockade this thing, right? And this is when like the Cold War really becomes an international like pissing contest. Now, I'll talk about this as I kind of go onto the map on the next page to explain this. Okay, so you've got right here in the blue the yellowish orange thing, and then the green. That's what's going to become West Germany, right? And then you have East Germany over on the right in the red, right? And then the red right here, sorry, is East Berlin, and the black is West Berlin, right? And essentially, what's going to happen is that the Allies had made a deal where they'd said, like, we like land and sea territory is territory of whoever occupies this area, right? But air is freedom for everybody, right? And so when Stalin blockades this, Truman and the Allies are going to respond with something called the Berlin Airlift, right? And so Stalin thinks, okay, I'll blockade this. They'll have to give in. I'll get all of Berlin. I'll get that area. That'll like give me an advantage, et cetera, et cetera. And as I said, this is when it becomes an international pissing contest, because what Truman and the other allies are decided they're going to do is they're going to basically airlift tons of supplies into Berlin, and that's what the map is showing you, with like planes going in that way and out this way. And these numbers are kind of staggering, okay, right? At their highest point, they bring in 1,534 tons of food and 3,457 tons of coal and gas a day to support West Germany's 2 million citizens. Flights land every 30 seconds, and they fly about 300,000 flights plus during this time, right? And they do this all solely so the Soviet Union will not be able to get its hands on West Berlin, right? Eventually, Stalin backs down, and things stay the way they are, and like by 49, the airlift had ended. But what's happened at this point is like the Cold War has set in full, right? You guys cannot cooperate to the extent that you are going to literally make us fly 300,000 flights plus a day, like every 30 seconds to get like things here all the time, right? And this really is when it becomes like a big deal. The Berlin airlift is generally seen as kind of like the first major event of the Cold War here. The next thing I want you to understand about the Cold War is a little bit of Cold War theory here, right? Um, and this is really kind of a three-step theory here. Okay, the first step is something called the Truman Doctrine, and this is something called the policy of containment, basically. And what this goes from is the United States shifts from a policy of détente, which is like, let's appease the Soviets and make everything okay, to a policy of containment, which means this quite literally, which is that we are going to, meaning the United States, going to contain communism, right? And this is called the Truman Doctrine. So basically, what this means is that the United States is not going to go into places that are already communist and stop them, right? They're not going to invade the Soviet Union. But what they are going to do is they are going to actively try and stop communism from spreading, right? So, like, for example, as will happen in the late 40s, early 50s, there's some communist rebellions in Greece and Turkey, and the United States will supply aids to, like, Greece hardcore to make sure that, like, they don't become communist, right? And that's what's meant by containment. We're going to contain communism where it already is, right? The reason for containment comes out of the second step, right? Which is something called domino theory, okay? Because domino theory subscribes to something that, if you remember, we talked about socialism in one country and Stalin and Trotsky, and this idea of permanent revolution. And the idea is that, like, if one country falls to communism, other places around it will fall, right? And, like, while that might be a bit of hyperbole, like to the United States, like credit on this, right? Like the Soviet Union fell to communism, then you had other places around it, then you had the Red Army taking that over. If you look on the other side, you had um, China, which borders on that, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this general worry with Greece and Turkey that like it will just kind of slowly spread. Not to mention, Marx and Trotsky had said, "Hey, we should slowly spread communism," right? So, the United States spends the vast majority of the Cold War operating with the idea of the Truman Doctrine, which is we should contain communism because if we don't, it will lead to something called domino theory, which is all the dominoes will fall and communism will become a worldwide phenomenon here. All this is eventually codified in something called NSC 68, right? And this becomes the official policy for the United States at this point. And this basically says that, like, as I just said, like, since like communism will continue to spread, we need to contain it, and therefore we need to make sure it doesn't happen. And the reason I bring this up is because basically from now until like the late 1980s, the NSC 68, this idea of containment because of domino theory, is going to be the epitome of United States foreign policy and exactly what and how we operate for the bulk of our time. And it really is like this is what I meant when I said Cold War theory. You need to understand what these are to understand the Cold War. Because if you understand that, you understand, okay, part of Korea became communist, so therefore the United States is operating under domino theory, so we need to quote unquote protect the rest of Korea or quote Vietnam or other places, Cuba later, from becoming communist. And this is really kind of important to understand like how the Cold War was quote unquote fought. This next slide, and don't worry, we're almost done, is just to give you an idea of what the Eastern Bloc, or the area that was kind of taken over by Stalin, or where the Red Army was left, is right there. I also want to kind of highlight the Republic of Poland right here. You'll notice right there that Poland is this kind of little sliver of a pink thing right there, and then you get this kind of like orange part right there. Well, what Stalin did, and this kind of is the epitome of oh, I don't know. It's just very problematic, for lack of a better word, was he said, okay, I'm going to keep the part of Poland that I took in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact because I want that, and then I'm going to take the rest of this part from Germany right here, and I'm going to give that to Poland. I'm going to move Poland over. So he literally picks Poland up and moves it to the right, or to the left, to the east, about 200 miles or so. It's something worth looking up called the Oder-Neser line, like, but it's really kind of like one of those things that I'm like, oh my god, that's the type of power you can't buy. It also gives you an idea of how scared of each other the Allies are. Like, the Allies are not going to stop Stalin from honoring a pact he made with Hitler. Yet on the other hand, like, Stalin is not going to overtly take all of what he wants because he's scared of the Allies. This eventual standoff leads to basically two spheres of Europe, okay? And I'll show you the map in 1 second so you can see it here. But essentially, by the end of this, Europe is going to be divided. That promise to hold free and fair elections occurs, and elections should be in air quotes, and free and fair should be in air quotes, in 1948 in Eastern Europe. And all the places that the not the United States, that the USSR had taken control of, all of those places are swept by communists. And then they turn around and outlaw other parties. So you can decide whether or not you consider that free or fair elections. Um, in order to solidify their partners, both the United States and the USSR create two very major treaty organizations. And you can see them right here in a second. And now that I've gone over, you can see them right here. The blue is going to be what's going to become known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And in a response to that, the red is going to be known as the Warsaw Pact. NATO is a alliance of the United States, Canada, and its North Atlantic allies. Basically, the requirements to be in NATO are that you have to be a democracy, or at least kind of nominally a democracy. You can debate Turkey as much as you want, right? You have to be in North America and Europe, right? We have something called SATO for like our Southeast Asian allies like Australia and New Zealand, right? You have to agree to spend 2% of your GDP on the military. That doesn't necessarily get followed, right? You have to be anti-communist and liked by the United States. That's not really a rule. And then the most important and famous part of NATO is the idea that an attack on one is considered an attack on all. Right, and when the Soviet Union founds the Warsaw Pact in 1955, it says the exact same thing. On a quick side note, very coincidentally, the only time that clause in NATO has ever been invoked has been on September 11th, 2001, when an attack on one was considered an attack on all, and NATO allies kind of rallied to the cause there. But these two alliances, what make up what's called eventually the First World, meaning like the US and its allies, and then the Second World, the Soviet Union and its allies, are what's going to be divided in kind of the Cold War here. And you can even see, if you look in East Germany there, that little part of like the what would be West Berlin, also blue in there. And so what you have in the end of this, by the time like kind of the Cold War has started here, is really a kind of hardcore divided Europe. Um, and all this comes to a headway on August 29th, 1949, when the Soviets detonate the first atomic bomb. The United States, if you remember, had dropped two atomic bombs. We mentioned this just in passing on August 6th and August 9th. You'll talk about a ton next year. A ton. That's saved for U.S. history, unfortunately, from my perspective, because I'd love to talk about it. And when that had happened in 45, the American spies had estimated that the Soviets were 10 years off. They kind of shocked the world 4 years later by detonating their first test bomb. And there are a number of issues involving that: the Red Scare, McCarthyism, the Rosenberg trials, et cetera, for next year. But the overarching point is this: is that the world has two nuclear powers now. And this is the heart of the Cold War, because now nuclear stockpile begins. At the height of this, each of these countries is going to have something like over 30,000 nukes, right? I mean, and they could blow each other up like 10 times over, right? And the last theory you need to understand Cold War theory is this: it's something called mutually assured destruction. And it's exactly what it sounds like. And it's the idea that both the United States and the USSR, or what is now Russia, could blow each other up a bazillion times over. And since it's in nobody's interest to end the world, nobody will. Hence the name of mutually assured destruction. As it says at the bottom, and I wish I could do this, normally at this point, guys, I'd take you out to the little grassy knoll on the side of Skyline, right? And I'd tell you to, do your Quiet Coyotes, and I'd read you a Dr. Seuss book called the Butter Battle book, which perfectly illustrates mutually assured destruction. If you have a chance, Google it or check it out, read it, listen to the video, etc., etc. Since I can't do that, I'm just going to tell you what it is and kind of lead you at that and point out that, one thing about mutually assured destruction is that it has worked so far. ... Okay, y'all, since we started here, I'll leave you here at the backside of Checkpoint Charlie. You're leaving the American sector. Very nice. That should give you an introduction to the Cold War. All right, everybody. Since we have been kind of working on the paper, we're going to finish it up this week, and this is really kind of all we're going to do. Just check online to make sure that, like, I think there's one other reading thing with it, and that's about it, just to make sure you're good on Spielvogel. Other than that, after this, we're going to start a new unit where we are going to mainly focus on Latin America in the Cold War, about a 75-25 split, Latin America versus kind of Europe on this. We'll look at the rise of communism. We'll look at like containment. We'll look at Che, Operation Condor, the Dirty War, etc., etc. It's actually one of my favorite units of the year. Um, Keep doing what you're doing. You guys have done a fantastic job so far with essential new learning and distance learning. Matheny and I really, really miss you. And hopefully, in the worst case, we'll see you guys in September. Enjoy, everybody. Talk to you soon.